Welcome to Torah Insight and Story. I'd like to dedicate this class to Sarah Leah Bas Mordechai in the occasion of her yahrzeit. May her neshama have an aliyah, her soul shall be elevated, and may she be looking down at us and praying for her family, for all of the Jewish people. And also I'd like to dedicate this class to the soul of Sarah Bas Avraham on the occasion of her untimely passing, and her neshama should have an aliyah, and her children should only know of goodness and happiness in the future. This week's parsha, very unique because it features the most important event in all of human history, the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And the Torah describes in detail how God speaks to Moses, preparing the people for this event. So let me just read a little bit of this. It's in chapter 19, where the Jewish people come to Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up to God, and God calls out to him and says the following. You should say the following to the house of Jacob, that refers to the women, and tell the sons of Israel, referring to the men. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I gathered you, and I protected you through the angel of God, as you were carried on eagle's wings, and I brought you to my presence. Now, if you listen to me and keep my covenant, you shall be a kingdom of ministers and a holy nation. And then it concludes, these are the words that you shall speak to the children of Israel. And the question here is, it starts off by saying, Moses went up to God, and God tells him to speak to the house of Jacob and to the sons of Israel, the children of Israel. He already told him what to say. Why does he have to add at the end of his communication to Moses, these are the words that you should speak to the Jewish people? Obviously, he's going to say the words that God told him to say. So Rashi apparently is addressing this question. Rashi quotes the Talmudic age midrash called the Mechilta, and says that what God says, these are the words that you should tell the people of Israel, he means these words, nothing less and nothing more. In other words, don't subtract and don't add on to these words. Why would anyone think that Moses, the most faithful of people in the world, would decide to not adhere to what God told him, to add on, to subtract? And that God had to emphasize. We don't find this any other place where God tells Moses, give over the message to the people, but don't add and don't subtract. Obviously, Moses is not going to change anything. Why over here was it so important that he doesn't add and doesn't subtract? So I saw this in a contemporary Hasidic commentary where he explains the following. At the very beginning of this communication, it says that God tells Moses, this is what you should say to the house of Jacob and tell the sons or the children of Israel. And as Rashi explains, that the house of Jacob refers to the women, and the sons of Israel, the children of Israel, refers to the men. But the manner in which you speak to them is different. When it comes to the women, the Torah uses a word that means softly. When you speak to them gently, softly. But when you speak to the men, the expression that's used has an implication that it means talk to them harshly, rigidly, toughly. Give it to them, really sock it to them. That to the women you don't have to be strong, the men you have to be strong. So one would have thought that if God was concerned about the manner in which Moses would communicate these messages, that God was telling Moses, you know what? you should use your oratorical skills to embellish the message. To the women, speak eloquently, speak in a way that will inspire them, add on to what I'm telling you. And to the men, you have to really give them fire and brimstone, really sock it to them. And he would add on or subtract. And God says, no, you don't have to do it. Just convey the message the way I communicated it to you. And there's a very powerful lesson over here. The lesson is, throughout Jewish history, there were always two approaches to trying to influence and inspire people. One approach that was often used was the fire and brimstone approach, where the Maggid, the preacher, the rabbi, the sage, would unleash fury against the people who were sinning. We find the prophets did this, and that has its place in Jewish culture and Jewish history and Jewish belief system. Sometimes you have to use tough love. But then there's the approach where you speak to them softly. You speak to them with gentle mannerisms. You speak to them in a loving way, words that come from the heart, words that are infused with feeling, with emotion, with love and passion. When the Baal Shem Tov came on the scene, Baal Shem Tov was born in 1698, and the Baal Shem Tov came a half a century after the most horrible pogroms in all of Jewish history. This is rates as one of the worst periods in all of Jewish history. In 1648 and 1649, the Cossacks massacred, the estimates are up until a few 100,000 Jews. And the Jewish people were totally demoralized. And then the false Mashiach, Shabtai Tzvi, arose and really wreaked havoc on the people, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And there were these itinerant Magidim, itinerant preachers would go around from town to town, and instead of uplifting the spirits of the broken, the shattered Jews who were poor, and most of them were orphans, most of them lost members of their family, most of them were without a livelihood, and they would work like slaves to eke out a meager living, and they were really devastated from all of the terrible things that happened within the last 50 years. And these itinerant rabbis were well-intentioned, would just sock it to them and really tell them in most harsh terms how they're going to be punished by God in Gehenna in the afterlife because of their sins, and that this punishment was because of their sins, and they're going to continue to get punished and suffer. People would cry, people would faint, people would collapse, and it would demoralize the people. It had the opposite effect. And at that point, the Baal Shem Tov arose and castigated these preachers and told them, this is not the way you speak to Jews. You speak to them with love. You speak to them with compassion. You speak to them with feeling that comes from the heart. And that was one of the major contributions of the Hasidic movement, that the approach of fire and brimstone, the approach of harshness, may have had its place in a certain time in Jewish history, but not now when we're in exile and we're suffering exile more than any time before. Now we have to use the other approach. These two approaches are represented by the women and the men. To the women, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a woman to have that positive approach, or necessarily that men are the ones whom you have to speak harshly, no matter how much that person is suffering. It means that when a person is a man, when a person is in a state of strength, and they're recalcitrant, they're rebellious, sometimes you have to use tough love. When a person is in a state, a feminine state, a state of warmth and passion and gentleness, you have to use that approach. And especially now, when we are living on the cusp of the Messianic age, the Kabbalists tell us that when Mashiach comes, the feminine spiritual quality will be dominant over the masculine spiritual quality. It doesn't mean that women will become men and men will become women. That's not a Jewish thing. That's not based on Torah. What it means is that men will acquire the superior spiritual quality of femininity. And even though we're still waiting for the redemption with Mashiach, we are on the cusp, we're on the threshold, and we're preparing for that. And right now, the Jewish people are in need of rabbis, of teachers, of mentors, of Jews in general, to speak to the Jewish people with love, with compassion, and with passion. Because when you speak words from the heart, where do those words from the heart come from? Those words of the heart come from your godly soul. And your godly soul doesn't need, you don't have to add, you don't have to embellish anything. Just give over the words. If they come from the heart, even a few select words will do their trick. On the other hand, when you don't have heartfelt feelings, when it's not coming from the heart, it's coming from a book. The book tells you to rebuke someone, so you rebuke them. You're not doing it because of your love for that person, because of your passion. You're doing it because of what you think you're doing the right thing. There's a lot of ego that is intermingled with your sense of injustice, or your sense of that indignation at the other person's behavior. And because you're speaking through your ego, the other person's ego puts up resistance to it and doesn't get the message. And you feel, well, I have to add on more. I have to embellish what I'm saying. No, the embellishment won't work. It'll just backfire. You have to speak from the heart, because then it's the godly soul speaking through you. And when the godly soul speaks, people are receptive, and it'll reach the core of that person's soul. That's the message that we get from here. Moses was told, don't add and don't subtract. Even if you have to use tough love, don't embellish it. Use it in the most limited way, in the most economical way. And the same thing when it comes to speaking from the heart, you don't have to add on words. These are God's words. They will do the trick. The story I'm going to tell is a story that happened in Israel. And here's a chassid. His name is David Glazer. And this is in 2007, I believe. And he's going in a neighborhood in Israel. And someone calls out to him and he says, I haven't seen you in such a long time. And I see someone, a municipal worker, painting the steps. And I didn't recognize him, so I said, could you please remind me how I know you? So he says, my name is Yehuda Veknin, and I come from this and this street. He gave his address. And I was in my house a few years back, and your clothing, you had a James Bond briefcase, whatever that is. And that's when I met you a number of years back. You were in my house a few years back and dressed that way. So I said, okay, what's the story? What's so significant about my being in your house? So he says, this is what happened. You were riding your bicycle, and you were talking to someone. And as soon as you saw me, I'm sure this is a little confusing the way it's written over here. I'm going to tell you the story. In other words, this is the guy that he met years back, and now he's seeing him again. He said, I'll tell you the story how I became observant, how I returned to Judaism. He says, 13 years ago, I had a very unique dream. I saw myself in a street called Shomron in Kiryat Malachi. That's in the southern part of Israel. And the street in my dream was full of garbage, and I had a hard time being able to get on this street. And then I see at the end of the street, there was one place that was extremely clean. I got to that place, and I see a table with a white tablecloth on it, and behind the table was the Rabbi. And I was trembling, and I go over to the Rabbi. The Rabbi looked at me with very good eyes and with a radiant face, and he says to me, how can I help you? And as I'm in my dream, I remind myself of a story my father used to tell us when we were young. There was a certain father, before he passed away, calls his 3 sons, and he says, ask me for one thing, and I will make sure that it will be fulfilled. So the first one asked for wealth. The second one says, to what do I need wealth if I'm not healthy? He asked for health. The third son said, I want a blessing. What happened? The father passes away, and all of their requests come to fruition. The first son was very wealthy, but he was also very ill. The second son was very healthy, but he was very poor. The third son, who just asked the generic word bracha, a blessing, was successful in every respect. So I remembered that story in the dream. So I asked the Rebbe in the dream for a bracha. The Rebbe smiled, and he took out a picture of himself, and he gave it to me, and he says, through this you will have a blessing. And then I woke up very emotional. I never felt so emotional in my life. The dream was so real, so vivid, that I saw that this was not just a dream. And I understood that the Rebbe was giving me a blessing, but I need the picture of the Rebbe. But I didn't know where I'm going to get a picture of the Rebbe. I wasn't religious. I had no connection to Chabad. And I was really getting very depressed because I saw that nothing's going to happen. I don't have that picture. And just then, that evening, there's a knocking on my door, and I see this religious person, this Chabad chassid, which is very strange. It never happened that any religious people would come to my door. I didn't live in that kind of a neighborhood. And he says, and it was you. You look the same as you look now, with your smile, and you came to visit me, a visit from the Chabad house. And we want to talk about Judaism, talk about Mashiach, talk about redemption. So then I realized I invited you to come into my house, and we began to speak about Mashiach and redemption. And then I offered to give you, the guest said, a picture of the Rebbe. And I almost fainted. And he says, at that moment, when that happened, I decided that I'm going to return to Judaism. And I bought tefillin and tzitzis and mezuzahs and a yarmulke and Jewish books. And I started a new life. It's all because of the Rebbe and the Rebbe's messenger, you, who brought me the picture of the Rebbe. That's the story, true story, that happened in 2007. Everyone should have a good Shabbos.